Hi everyone, I'm Natalie Alexander and welcome to The Commons, our space here at the UN Library Archives Geneva, dedicated to sharing questions and knowledge on multilateralism. This is our History series, where we get to explore the history of modern multilateralism through the help of experts and historians, and also through exploring some of the incredible archival documents held here at the UN Library Archives Geneva. In today's episode, we're exploring cartoons and how they can help us better understand the history of multilateralism, from the time of the League of Nations to today. Political cartoons and caricatures can often provide sharp insight and reflection on international issues, and in many ways can be more powerful than words. So, to what extent can cartoons help us to better understand our world today? How have the work and the role of cartoonists changed over time? And how can cartoons help us to understand multilateralism? We're here to explore these questions, and I'm very happy to introduce you to our speakers who are joining us online today. We have with us Corinne Momal-Vanian. She's the Executive Director of the Kofi Annan Foundation, and she's also a member of the Advisory Board of the Freedom Cartoonists Foundation. Corinne, thank you so much for being here and your time.
Good afternoon, Natalie. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you too. And also joining us is David McFadden. He is one of the co-authors of the book Political Cartoons of D'Urso and Kellen, Years of Hope and Despair. And he's also been working and researching with the other co-author of the book, Stefan Slater, who sadly couldn't be with us on video today, but he's been a big part of producing and researching this episode. And this book explores the life and the work of Alois D'Urso and Emery Kellen, two of the most prominent resident political cartoonists in Geneva at the time of the League of Nations. So let's jump right in. David, thank you so much also for joining us today.
Yes, delighted to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for representing both you and Stefan. Let's launch in. We are talking about cartoons, so I think we'd be remiss if we didn't take a look at one straight up. So here on your screen, you're going to see our first cartoon we wanted to present to you. This is by D'Urso and Kellen, and it's from their book United Nations Sketchbook, published in 1950. And as we start to look at this image, just to provide you some context, D'Urso and Kellen emigrated to the United States at the end of the 1930s, and hence also witnessed the birth of the UN in 1945. And so to the left, you see old diplomacy, and there you see a bilateral banquet of Western powers. And to the right, the new diplomacy, where we have the multilateral UN cafeteria, which you can see is more diverse geographically for the time, also with regard to gender and the menu of food that you see on offer there. And so from this, you can see how cartoons can tell us about the evolution of multilateralism. But you might notice there's something also missing from the right. The sketch was created before the decolonization process. And so delegates and diplomats from the African continent are clearly missing, as are women ambassadors. And so while the cartoon shows the principles on which the UN was founded, it also reflects change and its limits at the time. So just one cartoon to launch us off. Our first question is to you, Corinne. It's not very well known, but the former UN Secretary General and recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, Kofi Annan, valued political cartoons. And in 2006, he welcomed press cartoonists from all around the world to discuss cartoons and peace. And in 2006, you also worked closely with him. So our first question to you is, can you tell us a little bit more about this seminar that was founded in 2006?
Certainly, Natalie. First of all, yes, Kofi Annan was an avid reader of news. I mean, I remember one of our colleagues in the spokesperson's office called him a news junkie. He needed his news all the time, which is natural when you're Secretary General. But he always also had an eye for cartoons, because he used to say, if you are in front of a newspaper, you have to make a conscious choice to read a whole article, but your eye will always be caught by a cartoon and you will absorb it in any case. So at the end of 2005, as you may recall, there was, although you're very young, Natalie, so maybe not, but there was a big outcry in Europe and around the world, because cartoons were published by a Danish newspaper that were deemed very offensive to Islam. and there were riots and some loss of lives in the aftermath. And one French cartoonist, who was the main cartoonist in the journal Le Monde, in the newspaper Le Monde, Jean Plantureux is his original name, but he's known as Plantu, was very worried that cartoons should be seen as divisive when he had tried to use political cartoons for a few years already to start dialogues between, for instance, Palestinians and Israelis. So he came to see Kofi Annan in New York, and I remember attending the meeting and said, you know, we should use cartoons to bring people together and rather than divide them. And so they set up together this seminar in the fall of 2006, which was part of a series of seminars that was titled Unlearning Tolerance. And I think that was a wonderful title. And that seminar was really focused on the role of cartoonists in increasing understanding among people. Maybe by sharing a laugh, people can come together and agree that differences are a wealth and not necessarily a gap between people and cultures. And that also recognizing that political cartoonists really have a role to play in informing, in raising awareness about crisis, about difficult issues, in a way that some people could see as simplistic, but that is actually very astute and subtle. And after that seminar, that brought together cartoonists from around the world, but also civil society representatives, journalists, and others. The organization Cartooning for Peace was set up with two branches, a branch in France led by Plantu, and a branch in Switzerland led by another famous cartoonist, Chapat, who worked for a very long time for the New York Times and now for many European publications. And the Swiss association has since become the Freedom Cartoonist Foundation. And those two organizations have basically led the good fight to protect political cartoonists around the world, to raise awareness of some of the difficulties they may be facing. And I'm happy to discuss those a bit later. To educate children and youngsters on the role of cartoonists and the role of the press in general, and to bridge divides. So Kofi Annan was the honorary chair of the Cartooning for Peace Foundation when he was alive, and he always had a very soft spot for cartoons indeed.
Thank you for sharing this aspect of Kofi Annan that perhaps many of us didn't know about. You are now the executive director of the Kofi Annan Foundation, and it works for the promotion of democracy and Kofi Annan's values. You mentioned Plantu, who was one of the initiators also of the 2006 seminar, and he stated that cartoonists are the barometers of democracy. What is your reflection on that? And in your opinion, what is the role of cartoonists today?
So I would say that cartoonists are the barometer of freedom of the press, and that freedom of the press itself is the barometer of democracy. And unfortunately, the situation for freedom of the press is very dire today. The latest Press Freedom Index related to 2023 shows that in, I think it was 7 countries out of 10, the situation is very bad for the press. Which is a bad sign for democracy in general. I mean, the Kofi Annan used to say that, and I'll quote him exactly, that national and global media. Sorry, no, that's not the one. It was another quote I wanted to read. But basically, he was saying that when the press is muzzled, you can be quite sure that democracy in general will suffer. So you can say the freedom of the press is the canary in the coal mine, if you want, alerting to democracy in general. And in the press, cartoonists have a special role because of what I said, because they're very well known. I mean, I can assure you that a lot of readers of newspapers don't always know the names of the journalists who write long articles, but they always know the name of the cartoonist because that's the first thing that they will look at. So if things are bad for cartoonists, you know that they're bad for the press in general, and you know that democracy is suffering. So that for me is the chain. And this is why we at the Kofi Annan Foundation, yes, one of our main areas of work is the protection of and the promotion of democracy. And it is clear that things are not where they should be at the moment, that democracy for which Kofi Annan fought so hard during his time as Secretary General and then at the foundation has suffered on all continents, absolutely all continents. And some people say that we are back today approximately where we were in the 1980s as regards democracy. So we need to work, we need to make sure that cartoonists still have a space to do their work, their important work, and that journalists in general have a space to do their important work.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll also discuss a bit more with you about freedom of expression and speech a bit later in the episode. But firstly, to David. Here at the Library and Archives, we are custodians of the League of Nations archives, and so many of the questions related to political cartoonists are not new. And that's why we wanted to really dive a little bit deeper into the work of D'Urso and Kellen, two of the most famous cartoonists who worked in Geneva at the time of the League. So to you, David, could you tell us more about D'Urso and Kellen and why it was important for you and Stefan to write a book about these two cartoonists?
Well, if I could just follow on from Corinne and to say that I began my international career as a young doctor in the World Health Organization, as, by the way, did Kofi Annan, not as a doctor, as an administrator. And he told the story that when his family in Ghana heard that he was joining as P1, they thought he was joining as head of the organization. So he had a wonderful sense of humor. I went to Geneva and I went to the Brasserie Bavaria. And in the Brasserie Bavaria, which was the gossiping place of the League, there were 150 cartoons on the wall by D'Urso and Kellen. So that sparked my interest. When I got a little bit senior and I went to the World Health Assembly at the Palais des Nations, I used to spend some time, not too much, in the Bar de la Presse. And there on the wall of the Bar de la Presse, there were 15 cartoons by D'Urso and Kellen purchased by the League of Nations. And I admired them very much at that particular time. And then after I retired, I had been carrying a little card in my pocket for a while, and I thought we should do a little bit about the first Secretary General of the League of Nations, Eric Drummond. And I live in Scotland, and I was given access to the family papers of the Drummond family. And I found that Eric Drummond kept a cartoon of D'Urso and Kellen. So I say my interest was growing, and my wife exhibits cartoons, exhibits the work that she does with sewing. And at one of those exhibitions, I met Stefan. And I said to Stefan, by any chance, do you have cartoons by D'Urso and Kellen? And I nearly dropped down when he said, well, yes, I do. And he brought in the next day 3 portfolios. So that's what sparked my interest. There was a conference in Edinburgh in 2020 on the centennial of the League, and Stefan and I presented a paper on what we called visual evidence through cartoons. That was successful, and we wrote an article, and finally we decided to write a book, which came out last year, The Political Cartoons of D'Urso and Kellen.
Could you tell us
how it began?
Yeah, it would be interesting for us to have a little bit of insight into how they worked at the time of the League of Nations. How did they gain access to personalities? And what was their dialogue like with journalists? Is there anything that you could share?
Well, yes. They met in 1922 in Lausanne. They came for the last conference at the end of the Great War. And they were both from Hungary, and so they had much in common. And they were drawing cartoons individually, and they decided to draw them together in a very unique way, that they worked as a duet. one was left-handed and the other was right-handed, and they worked together on the cartoons, and that is unique about their work. After the Lausanne Conference, they moved to Geneva, where we say they embedded themselves in the League, and they saw what the League was doing from day to day. They produced their first portfolio in Geneva on the work of the League, and this contained mostly caricatures of the people, and it was a very important function because it allowed those who were coming to Geneva to recognize the characters who were speaking at the assembly, the League Assembly, and in the council. Many journalists were doing the same thing at that time, and there were others who were publishing cartoons. But what made them unique is to say they were embedded, and they saw not just the work of the assembly and the work of the council, but they also saw what the Secretariat was doing, and that was unusual at the time. And they had a deep insight. The largest part of the Secretariat was the information section, and there were many journalists in that, and they were accredited journalists to the League of Nations.
Incredible. I also wanted to explore with you, David, how they depicted the evolution of multilateralism. So both D'Urso and Kellen, witnessed the League, and the title of your book really emphasizes years of hope, but also years of despair, reflecting this trajectory from the enthusiasm of the second half of the 1920s to the crisis of the 1930s. So could you share with us, how did they see and depict multilateral cooperation, but also this crisis in multilateral cooperation?
Well, let me describe this in D'Urso and Kellen's own words. They composed a portfolio of cartoons on the first decade of international cooperation. The purpose of that, they said, was to reflect on how nations learned to work together. The cartoons they drew weren't like those we see in today's newspapers. One from the portfolio that I just mentioned, La Tour de Babel, featured 272 League of Nations personalities. La Saut de la Tribune, which dealt with freedom of the press, depicted the politics of 1936. That took them 3 months to compose. They showed largely forgotten multilateral initiatives on social questions, on refugees, and on economic cooperation. They were not, however, uncritical, especially in regard to the League's failing in peace and security. We learn from their cartoons that as early as 1932, the writing was on the wall for the League. Around the time of the World Disarmament Conference, they began to use the snail as an icon of the organization. By 1938, the main symbol of the League of Nations, as an appealing and attractive Miss Geneva, became a diminutive figure, drawn as armless and legless. However, they resumed their gentle satire, producing cartoons for a series of international conferences on multinational cooperation held during the Second World War. The first, held in Hot Springs, Virginia in 1943, led to the creation of FAO. In 1945, they produced amusing cartoons at the conference in San Francisco that drafted the UN Charter, which reaffirms faith in fundamental rights, fundamental human rights, and the dignity and worth of the human person, and in equal rights of men and women. One contemporary cartoon shows Eleanor Roosevelt teaching human rights to a classroom of politicians. Not all were obedient pupils. They show multinational cooperation beginning anew in their United Nations sketchbook, and Natalie, you just showed one of the cartoons from this. As was their case with their publications in the League, this album includes cartoons in the work of the Secretariat. We see the work of a UN peace mediator, Dr. Ralph Bunge, removing spikes from the trunk of a tree in Palestine. Bunge succeeded in securing an armistice agreement between Israel and Egypt, and subsequently between Israel and Jordan, Lebanon and Syria. This shows what the League can achieve when an international civil servant is impartial, effective, and persistent. I think you got a shot of my wife there coming in. I have a little dog here, came in. Sorry about that.
No worries. Thank you for sharing that. And you did mention this, that they were critical, but also that their work reflected this gentle satire. But in many ways, I guess their work was not always easy. I mean, seeing this transition also to a crisis and the transition to the UN, what were the main challenges you think they had to overcome as political cartoonists?
Well, they caricatured the League Secretary General, Eric Drummond, many times. But they did so, as you say, gently, and clearly he wasn't offended, because when he left the League, he took one away with him. They did, however, cross the line with Drummond. They portrayed the poet and delegate of Romania, Helen Vacarescu, as ungainly and obese. When she complained that this ridiculed member states, the cartoon was removed from display. Immediately, the world press rushed to support Derso and Kellen, and Sir Eric bowed to the pressure of the press. Yes, they informed public opinion about multilateral cooperation, and they did so in a humorous way. But in 1938, they began to draw more militant cartoons. They drew those for the US magazine Ken. This was a publication that sought to inform Americans about the Nazi threat, but was perceived as warmongering. It was boycotted and had to close in 1939. Dag Hammarskjöld, by the way, complimented Kellen on the intelligent humor in the cartoon history of the United Nations. Today's UN Secretary General would surely identify with one of Derso and Kellen's cartoons. This shows the League Secretary General seated on a treasure chest, defending the budget with a pair of pistols.
Thank you for sharing some of these anecdotes. And it's interesting to see, of course, that they faced challenges as political cartoonists in reflecting multilateralism. And we wanted to connect that also to today's world. The world landscape for cartoonists is different to that of Derso and Kellen's. Today, the profile of cartoonists has changed. There are more women cartoonists. There are more cartoonists around the world. So we have more diversity, more viewpoints. But also social media has helped to promulgate and have more visibility for political cartoons. So back to you, Corinne. Today, the Kofi Annan Courage in Cartooning Award is given every 2 years to recognize cartoonists for their work and also their bravery for their arts, especially often under difficult circumstances. So what do you think are the main challenges today for cartoonists and caricaturists?
Well, the main challenges is just a growing intolerance of dissent, whether it comes in with humor or not. Is just, as I was mentioning before, the space for dissent in the press in general is really closing down. There is also what is I think a particular challenge is that there's a lot of volatility in each country in what is tolerated and or not. So the authorities can become more and more aggressive in clamping down on the press in general and cartoonists in particular, but it can be quite unexpected. So a cartoonist who was used to being quite irreverent in a given country can suddenly find himself or herself in hot waters for just one simple cartoon that maybe 3 months earlier would have gone unnoticed by authorities. So I think this not knowing where the authorities draw the line is becoming very, very difficult. We have quite a few cartoonists are simply in jail now for their work. So this is one of the main things that the Freedom Cartoonist Foundation does. It has a fund, a financial fund, to support cartoonists in danger, because if they can no longer work, they lose simply their income, which is often how authorities manage to discourage them. Of course, everyone has to feed their families. So there's a fund for cartoonists in danger, also sometimes to help them escape, frankly. The Courage in Cartooning Award which is given every 2 years and that carried the name of Kofi Annan, is a way of protecting cartoonists by giving them international fame as well. So they are brought to Geneva, they're given an international platform, and that's a way also of giving them a little bit of international protection, of course. So raising awareness, providing them with material support sometimes is some of the things that the foundation, the Freedom Cartoonist Foundation does. The one of the other unexpected aspect maybe of today's landscape is the uncertainty about what new technologies mean. You have mentioned, Natalie, that social media help cartoons spread faster, which is true as well. But they also, we know that that some of the technologies, in particular in artificial intelligence, help authorities clamp down on dissent. So it goes both ways. And one question which we haven't really seen addressed yet is, which is already a question with other artists, is whether artificial intelligence will replace cartoonists, and whether some publications will find it cheaper to use artificial intelligence tools. I certainly hope not, because the subtlety and the humor of cartoonists, I think, are essentially human, and they have an incredible role to play, as we were saying. But it is an uncertain time. It's a difficult time. It's an uncertain time for cartoonists, and they need our support.
Yeah, you mentioned this backdrop that we have of uncertainty, intolerance. So how do you think this impacts, in your view, how multilateral cooperation is reflected in cartoons today?
You know, again, it's a matter of the canary in the coal mine, because what worries me maybe more, and I don't have numbers here, Natalie, but I have a feeling that multilateral cooperation is not depicted by cartoonists as much as it was 10 or 20 years ago. And that worries me, because it means that the people are losing faith in international cooperation at a time when it's needed more than ever. We have tons of excellent instruments, multilateral instrument to facilitate cooperation, but if the political will is not there, these instruments will not be used. So, and the fact that I'm trying to recall the last time I saw a political cartoon that showed the United Nations at work, or that lampoon the Secretary General. That would be welcome, actually, because in a way we say, there is no bad publicity. There is, we want the United Nations and other multilateral organizations to be present in the press, to be made fun of in cartoons. But if they're not, it's actually for me more of a worry, because it means people don't understand as much as they did maybe 10 or 20 years ago the relevance and urgency of multilateral cooperation. So it's a difficult time both for cartoonists and both for multilateral organizations. And David was talking about the cartoon of the Secretary General sitting on the chest, on the treasure chest, and that chest is empty today, as you well know, Natalie. That chest is empty, which is a reflection of maybe of a lack of commitment of all member states to the functioning of indispensable international organizations. And I am not normally a pessimist at all. I always try to see the silver lining, but at the moment there is such ill will in the corridors of multilateral diplomacy that it's difficult to find the silver lining. So maybe I need a very good cartoonist to lift my spirits here, Natalie.
Thank you for sharing those insights, because it's interesting, because we also wanted to look at what can we learn from cartoons about multilateralism. And political cartoons, if we look in history books and manuals, are often there for visual impact, but also today are being used more as primary sources. So David, to you, in your view, can we learn history and the history of multilateralism through the D'Urso and Kellen drawings?
Well, Corinne, I have a response to you. I think if you're looking for a cartoonist, I can recommend two, D'Urso and Kellen. And I can tell you they will strengthen your faith, and I hope the public's faith in international cooperation. And to respond to what Natalie just asked me, Stefan and I illustrate our book with 102 cartoons. These convince Frank Muller, he is a social scientist at Tampere University in Finland, that political cartoons appear as legitimate objects of scholarly study. This is a quote from his review in International Affairs, the Journal of Chatham House, the British think tank, and in Foreign Affairs. Muller's review was very gratifying to Stefan and me, for we say in the very first chapter that history leaves its imprint through evidence, and subsequently and frequently that evidence is visual. Readers will learn from our book how international cooperation evolved after the First World War. And they record this, the contemporary visual images of Derso and Kellan record this. Their unique collaboration began, as I said earlier, in Lausanne in 1922. They were attending the last of the conferences that followed the First World War, and they produced a large lithograph called Pax, Peace, drawn a week before the signing of the Lausanne Peace Treaty. The striking fact that we learn from this tableau is the war didn't end at Versailles, but in the date of this cartoon, the 24th of July, 1923, which records the peace between the Allies and Turkey. We comment in our book that this forgotten era of post-1919 conflict witnessed what historians called the civilization of war, which goes on today. We learn much more from Pax. The United States wasn't a signatory of the treaty. Why then did the artist include the erect figure of an American ambassador at the historic table at which the treaty was signed? And why do the wings of one angel display the stars and stripes of the US flag? Well, that American cherub was named Chester, who is seen collecting a cascade of money from a cornucopia, a reference to a monopoly granted by a US company to build a railway to the oil reserves of Iraq. In his autobiography, Kellan explained that there were all sorts of subsidiary problems in Lausanne, which even today are as fresh as the morning dew. Oil, which everybody wanted, and refugees whom nobody wanted.
Thank you for sharing. And we're going to be looking at some cartoons very soon. David, sorry.
Just if I could just go on a little bit on that. In 1931, Derso and Kellan published an illustrated history of the first decade of international cooperation. It depicts politicians, diplomats, and officials of the League in the Garden of Eden, and we'll see that cartoon shortly. All save two are Europeans, and only two are women, although the League covenant specified that all positions shall be equally open to men and women. Eve is shown with a typewriter as a subordinate helper to a male official. Thus, we learn from this opening image of Le Testament de Genève that despite its aspirations, the League was Eurocentric and male-dominated. From the entire album, we learn that the League was doing learned what the League was doing from day to day. This encompassed many fields beyond peace and disarmament. As I mentioned before, these economic and technical functions expanded after 1945 within various agencies of the UN. Derso and Kellan's UN sketchbook, published in 1950, includes a wonderful example of their work. A colourful cartoon in which the UN is the trunk of a tree and the UN agency its branches. A significant detail shows the Secretary General attempting to pacify a cat and dog fight. Here, Trigg-Villie is symbolically facing down a breakdown in peace with the power given to him under Article 99 of the Charter. The present Secretary General invoked this rarely used article to call a meeting of the Security Council on the conflict in Gaza.
Fascinating. Thank you, David. We're going to look at some cartoons very soon. But firstly, we wanted to come back to you, Corinne. You mentioned briefly before about the role of cartoonists and what this means also for freedom of speech, freedom of expression. In a multicultural environment that we found ourselves in, how can we defend freedom of speech in a spirit of dialogue?
But this is exactly what brought Kofi Annan and Plantu at the very start of the story in 2006 for this Unlearning Intolerance webinar on cartooning for peace. What Kofi Annan believed was that the cartoonists should know themselves what is offensive and unacceptable, and what is funny and provocative. And he didn't believe that the authorities should decide that for the cartoonists. He said the editors and the cartoonists themselves should make that choice, not the authorities. But he didn't. He was completely in agreement with Plantu that the cartoonists have to develop a sense, and that's why Cartooning for Peace was created, is to bring cartoonists together from different cultures, from different faith, from different linguistic worlds, to discuss together what is offensive, what is acceptable. Sometimes you need to be offensive in a cartoon, but what is the limit? Where do you cross a limit where you actually incite violence or incite hatred? But it's a very, very delicate and difficult discussion, and I don't think anyone has managed to find good answers to that. So we need cartoonists to spur dialogue and to spur even dissent sometimes, but we must know when offense is unnecessary, or where in a world of tensions, of very heightened tensions, where a drawing could inflame passions in a way that is actually unhealthy. So this is, I certainly don't have an answer to this very difficult question, Natalie, but this is something that really preoccupied Kofi Annan, despite his love for cartoons. And one thing which I should have mentioned also is that in his house, he had cartoons on the wall, in his house. So he really loved cartoons in a very profound way. But I know that this is an issue that was at the start of his discussions with Plantu.
Amazing. Well, let's look at some cartoons now then. I think we've waited long enough. Thank you very much for sharing, Corinne. It's tradition for us in HiStories to dive into our archives, select some documents to share with you. But before we get there, David and Stefan have selected 3 cartoons that particularly speak to them that we'd like to share with you now. David, the challenge for you is to present these briefly so that we can also look at some from the archives. But I pass the floor to you now to present Le Paradis or Paradise, also The Big Parade, and the final one, Boots, Gloves and Refugees.
Good. Well, let me begin with a short introduction. The UN wanted to acquire Derso and Kellen's cartoons because they appreciated their historical importance. UN New York wanted it. UN Geneva wanted it. What happened in the end was that the family donated the cartoons to Princeton University Library. Very appropriately so, because this was Woodrow Wilson's own university, where he framed, in Betty Kellen's words, the priceless ideal that mankind can one day talk itself out of wars and find peace. So let's begin with the first cartoon. Can you show it now?
There we go.
This is Le Paradis. Can you see this? It's a beautiful watercolor, a biblical allegory of the aspiration of the League to create a new paradise. And it was drawn at a time when Europe might have taken a different path. 2 recent accounts of the League, produced in English and Japanese by historians, employ this image as the cover of a book. The image approaches fine art in quality. It's an engaging and imaginative composition of the leading politicians and officials of the League portrayed as animals. The cartoon can be accessed online at Princeton, and we analyze it in our book.
Incredible.
Go to the next.
Yes, the big parade.
The big parade is the beginning of the disarmament conference. Corinne, there are two ladies in it, but you have to look very carefully to see who they are. One is Louise Weiss, and after whom I think there's a building named in Strasbourg, and the other was an American who was an advocate of peace from the Women's League. It shows, I think it does show a little bit the idealism of the League. I think they said that Cecil, who's in this, had both feet in the air. So that is the beginning of the disarmament conference that went nowhere. Next one, please.
Yes, and now we have Boots, Gloves and Refugees.
Well, this is a very striking image, and it shows the people scared and fleeing from the Nazi boot, but you see they are restrained by the white consular gloves, denying entry. So this is one of the most powerful cartoons that they created, and shows that the difficulty that those who try to flee the Nazis are faced when they try to enter other countries.
Thank you for selecting those, David.
Yeah.
David and Stefan, you've also selected 3 from our archives here in Geneva that we're going to look at and analyse now. The first one is called Menu, Lunch of the International Association of Journalists, accredited to the League of Nations, dated 1926. David, over to you.
Well, this cartoon, Toast de Stresemann, shows the shaggy-haired French statesman Aristide Briand toasting the bald German foreign minister Gustav Stresemann. Seated next to Stresemann is the Secretary General of the League, Eric Drummond. The scene is a press lunch for the Council and President of the League Assembly. The date is 10th of December 1926. The toast is to Germany becoming a member of the League. A week later, Briand and Stresemann sealed post-war reconciliation between France and Germany at a lunch in the French village of Thoiry. Until then, Germany had been a pariah nation. A Belgian delegate to the League said that he had not spoken to a German since 1914. As you can see, the four signatories who signed Locarno also signed this cartoon. It charts the beginning of a close collaboration between Stresemann, Briand, and British Foreign Minister Austen Chamberlain, during which Briand set out his ideas for European Union. The collaboration was considered by Derso and Kellen to be one of the noblest pages in the history of the League. I found that Sir Eric Drummond had kept a similar cartoon in his private papers, a menu card of the lunch that took place 6 months later. In this, the Secretary General was Stresemann's guest of honour, a recognition of Drummond's long advocacy to admit Germany to the League. Drummond's aspiration for universal membership wasn't realised, but the strength of today's international collaboration lies in the expansion of the 42 member states of the League to today's UN membership of 193.
Wow, thank you, David, for that context. The next cartoon you've selected is called Parting of the Waters of the Red Sea from 1931.
The American historian Susan Pedersen included this cartoon in her masterly review, Back to the League, which changed the historiography of the League. She did this because it features League civil servants. Centre stage is the first Secretary General, Eric Drummond, whose legacy is today's International Secretariat. Drummond shows remarkable insight, the artists show remarkable insight in placing those around Drummond. Close to him, there's a tight group of 3 people. This physical proximity corresponds to the values they shared. The bearded, charismatic ILO director, Albert Thomas, has a large presence. Perched on Drummond's shoulder is Under-Secretary General Yutaro Sugimura from Japan, in whom Drummond placed total trust. Supporting the Secretary General and the Under-Secretary is Pierre Comer, Director of the Information Section, whom Drummond used as a trusted link to the French government, rather than his French deputy, Joseph Avenel, who sits far from the trio on a turtle with a toy gun. Two Under-Secretaries are marginalised as they were in life and are depicted as disruptive juveniles. These are the Italian Giacomo Paolucci with a child's fishing net, who made trouble for Drummond with his overt fascism. His German counterpart, Albert Dufour-Ferrance, with a model yacht, served his own government, not the League. It is the central characters who conform to Drummond's norms of loyalty to the League and impartiality. The behaviour of the peripheral figures betray his concept of a secretariat that operated without undue influence from national governments. Drummond succeeds in parting the waters and crossing the sea, but towering above are looming crises: the stock market crash, unemployment, burgeoning nationalism, dumping of agricultural products, financial woes, and the communist threat. The placing of Henri Bonnet at the bottom right, riding a seahorse, perhaps mocks his field of work, intellectual cooperation, which doesn't address the threats which the League faced.
Wow, it's incredible to see some of the intricacies of how personalities are represented there. Thank you, David. The final cartoon we're going to see today is called Please Replace the Turf from 1932.
Yes, well, this shows the man I mentioned earlier, Yutaro Sugimura, playing golf at One. And he's slicing a turf, which is symbolically Manchuria. And he sent in the direction of Stimson, the US Secretary of State. US Secretary of State Stimson did not recognize Japan's invasion of Manchuria. And ever since then, there is non-recognition of lands that are acquired by aggressive invasion. If you look where the ball is going in the direction of Eric Drummond's nose. Again, a little bit of suggestion that this is a failure of the League, through which Manchuria was. But I don't particularly think a failure of the Secretary General. It's a little bit unfair to Sugimura because he was not at all aggressive and Japanese. He was a very loyal League servant, as I mentioned earlier.
Thank you, David, and to Stefan as well for selecting those 6 cartoons. It's interesting to see the black and white, also the colour, some humour, but also some of the horror that humanity has faced and how diverse these cartoons can be in communicating this. Corinne, having seen those 6 cartoons, our final question is to you. In your opinion, which of these resonates with our world today if you have to pick one?
I think the last one, unfortunately, we have too many cases of nations trampling on others at the moment, on the rights of others, invasions against the Charter of the United Nations, brutality and arrogance of some people in power. So unfortunately, this resonates a lot today. But I want to say how absolutely wonderful the whole series was. And I was just trying to imagine if the UN had the luxury today of having 2 embedded cartoonists, what they would draw on a daily basis. But my sense is that would not have the luxury of time that David sort of described. They could sit and draw things, sometimes taking months to draw very intricate pictures. Today, cartoonists would be under incredible time pressures to produce something for social media or something, but they would have so many things to depict at the moment. But that last one, unfortunately, seems to depict in some ways the mood of the day. But what incredible treasure trove has been unearthed there. And I will be sure to look at all of them and to come and look at the archives at the Palais and other archives, because they are they are absolutely incredible windows into a different time. Just one last thing, Natalie, I wanted to tell you that what you don't know is that on my wall here in my office, I have 3 cartoons by Plantu, including one on the United Nations that I find very touching from back after the 2004 tsunami, when the UN really organized relief on a completely unprecedented scale for the victims of the Indian Ocean tsunami. And it's a wonderful cartoon that depicts a UN force going in, and with these doves flying above the UN force, and this big wave showing just the power of that image to show that human kindness and human solidarity can do so much to fight against sometimes it's natural disasters, and sometimes it's man-made disasters. So just say that I'm so happy that you have shone a light today on the power of cartoons.
Thank you so much, Corinne, for sharing that. It's good to know you have some cartoons on your wall to inspire you, but also the questions you raised about the role of cartoonists and the space they have today, I think is a really good way to end. Corinne, Momal-Vanian, and David McFadden, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Pleasure, Natalie. Thank you.
Also to Stefan Slater for his time in the research as well. We really appreciate that. Thank you for joining us today for today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to consult some of the documents or the archives from today and plenty more, we can show you and give you the links to research and to access the UN Archives Geneva platform. And if you have a research question, you can also ask an archivist. We'll have the links in the YouTube description below. You can also access all episodes of the HiStories series here on the YouTube channel of the UN Library and Archives Geneva. Until next time, thank you so much for joining us, and take care. Bye for now.